He didn't look at her when he signed it. "It is just a contract," the Duke muttered, wiping a spot of excess ink from his thumb. And for 6 months, Genevieve believed him. She played the quiet-bought bride perfectly, right up until the moment the heavy silk of her wedding dress tore a jagged, violently loud sound echoing through the empty manor. That was the moment the Duke of Ashbourne finally looked at her, and the moment he completely shattered. The nib of the pen scratched against the heavy vellum. It was an awful sound. Wet, sharp, final. Genevieve sat perfectly still in the leather wingback chair, her hands folded over her lap. Her right shoe pinched at the toe. The leather was old, the sole wearing thin, but she kept her feet tucked carefully beneath the hem of her wool skirt. She focused on the pain in her toe to ignore the smell of the room. It smelled of floor wax, stale rain, and the sour tang of her father's nervous sweat. "Signed by the seal Lord Croft." The magistrate murmured, a man whose face seemed entirely constructed of gray shadows. Her father's hand was shaking. Genevieve watched the tremor travel from his hunched shoulder down to his wrist. He was a man who had lost his fortune at card tables and horse tracks, chasing the thrill of the turn until there was nothing left to wager but his daughter's name. He dropped the pen twice before he managed to scratch his name across the bottom of the page. William Croft, a signature worth £40,000 in cleared debts. Across the wide expanse of the mahogany desk sat Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Ashbourne. He had not looked at her since she entered the room. He sat with the rigid posture of a man bracing for an impact. His shoulders were broad beneath a charcoal-colored coat, his cravat tied with suffocating precision. There was no poetry in his face. It was all harsh angles, a sharp jaw, a straight aristocratic nose, and eyes the color of old shillings, flat and hard. "Is the bank draft prepared?" Arthur asked. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It didn't resonate with warmth. It sounded like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "It is your grace," the magistrate replied, sliding a slim slip of paper across the desk. Her father snatched it. He didn't mean to look quite so desperate, Genevieve thought, but the sudden jerky movement gave him away. He folded the paper quickly, shoving it into his breast pocket as if the room might catch fire and consume it. He let out a breath, a wet, rattling sigh of relief that made Genevieve's stomach turn. "Well," her father said, clapping his hands together. The sound was horribly loud in the quiet study. "It's settled. I leave her in your capable hands, Ashbourne." Genevieve did not look at her father. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she might scream or cry or throw the heavy brass paperweight sitting on the edge of the desk. Instead, she stared at the ink drying on the contract. Marriage. It was a sterile word for what had just occurred. A transaction. An acquisition. Arthur finally moved. He reached for the pen, dipped it in the brass inkwell, and signed his own name with swift, aggressive strokes. "It is a contract, Lord Croft." Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the paper. He wiped a small smear of ink from his thumb with a white linen handkerchief. "Nothing more. I have provided the capital you require to keep your estate out of the hands of the creditors. In exchange, your daughter will provide me with the respectability of a quiet, scandal-free marriage." He folded the handkerchief and placed it back in his pocket. He looked up, and for the first time his eyes met Genevieve's. There was no pity in his stare, no lust, no warmth. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sturdy piece of furniture he has just purchased for the drawing room. Functional, necessary, dull. "You understand the terms, Miss Croft?" he asked. "I do, your grace," Genevieve said. Her voice sounded thin, reedy, like a violin string stretched too tight. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I am to reside in the East Wing. I am to accompany you to social engagements twice a month. I am to ask no questions regarding your private affairs, and I am to expect no interference in mine, provided I do not embarrass the Ashbourne name." Arthur gave a single stiff nod. Precisely. She waited for him to say something else. Something human. A pleasantry, perhaps. A hollow reassurance that they would make the best of it. but Arthur merely turned back to his ledger, flipping a page with a dry rustle of paper. My carriage will take you to the London townhouse, Miss Croft. The seamstresses are expecting you tomorrow morning to begin work on your wardrobe. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks. He did not look up. Good day. Genevieve stood. Her knees felt locked, her joints filled with sand. She did not curtsy. She simply turned and walked toward the heavy oak door. Her father scurried after her, his boots loud against the floorboards, but Genevieve only heard the scratching of Arthur's pen. He was already working on the next transaction. She stepped out into the damp London air, the fog clinging to her cheeks like cold, wet silk. She was not a woman. She was a line item in a ledger. And as she climbed into the crest-emblazoned carriage, Genevieve made a quiet, cynical vow to herself she would not bleed for a man who only saw her in black and white. The fitting room was suffocating. It smelled intensely of lavender water, hot irons, and the sour, anxious sweat of the 3 seamstresses swarming around Genevieve's feet. Hold your breath, miss. Just a fraction more, muttered Mrs. Higgins, a woman with a mouthful of pins and fingers like iron calipers. Genevieve exhaled, her ribcage compressing, and Mrs. Higgins yanked the corset laces tight. A sharp physical ache bloomed in Genevieve's lower back, radiating up her spine. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. There, a 17-inch waist. The Duke will be pleased. Mrs. Higgins declared, tying off the laces with a vicious tug. Genevieve stared at her reflection in the tall pier glass. She didn't look like herself. Her skin, usually a healthy working-class flush from walking the moors near her father's crumbling estate, looked sallow in the harsh afternoon light of the townhouse. Her brown hair was pinned severely to her skull, but it was the dress that commanded the room. It was oyster-white silk, heavy as water, and stiff with seed pearls. It didn't look like clothing. It looked like architecture, a fortress constructed of tulle whalebone and thread designed to house the Ashbourne legacy. Sitting on a velvet chaise longue in the corner was Lady Agatha Arthur's widowed aunt. She was a woman who seemed entirely composed of sharp angles and black bombazine. She held a cup of tea, the delicate china looking absurdly small, in her claw-like hands. The neckline is too low. Lady Agatha observed, her voice cutting through the humid air of the fitting room like a razor. She has collarbones like a starved bird. We must cover them with Brussels lace. Arthur dislikes displays of poverty, and nothing screams pauper quite like protruding bones. Genevieve's jaw locked. She wanted to snap to remind the old bat that she wouldn't be a pauper if her father hadn't gambled away her dowry. But the contract echoed in her mind a quiet, scandal-free marriage. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat and let her eyes drift out the window to the gray, rain-slicked streets. The heavy oak door creaked open. The chatter of the seamstresses instantly died. Arthur stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark riding habit, smelling faintly of leather horse sweat and the sharp bite of the cold outdoors. His dark hair was slightly damp, curling at the very ends, a stark contrast to his usual rigid appearance. He froze when he saw her. For a fraction of a second, something flared in his flat, shilling-colored eyes. A tightening, a fracture in his composure. His gaze dropped from her face to the heavy silk of the skirt, up to the tightly laced bodice, and finally to her bare neck. He swallowed. Genevieve watched the bob of his Adam's apple against his cravat. Then the shutter slammed back down. His face returned to a mask of polite indifference. I apologize for the intrusion. Arthur said, his voice clipped. He stepped into the room holding a flat velvet box. I was told I would find you here. I brought the Ashbourne sapphires. They are traditionally worn by the bride during the ceremony. Lady Agatha sniffed. They are quite heavy, Arthur. I fear the girl's neck might snap under the weight. They are necessary, Arthur replied, not looking at his aunt. He walked toward Genevieve. The seamstresses parted like the Red Sea, backing away with lowered eyes. Arthur stopped inches from Genevieve. Up close, she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the dark smudges that spoke of sleepless nights. He smelled of rain. and something inherently male and tense. He opened the box. The necklace was a monstrous thing, thick silver vines choking massive cold blue stones. It looked like a collar. "Turn around," he instructed softly. Genevieve obeyed, her heavy silk skirt rustling loudly. She felt the sudden shocking chill of the metal against her collarbone. It was a complete contradiction to the man who had bought her. They brushed against the nape of her neck. She flinched. His skin was warm, not out of slightly fear, rough, but because the contrast was agonizingly gentle. Arthur pulled his hands back. It was a complete contradiction, as if he had been burned. The necklace settled heavily against her chest, a cold weight pressing against her sternum. "It is fastened," he said, taking a step back. His voice was suddenly hoarse. He cleared his throat violently. "Ensure the seamstresses reinforce the bodice to support the weight of the stones, Mrs. Higgins." "Of course, Your Grace," the seamstress murmured. Arthur looked at Genevieve in the mirror. Their eyes met in the reflection. He looked trapped. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the drop, but unable to step back. "It is acceptable," he said to her reflection, his tone returning to that of a bored magistrate. "You look appropriate." He turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Genevieve stared at herself. The sapphires glittered like ice. The silk pressed against her ribs. She was wrapped in thousands of pounds of wealth, yet she had never felt so utterly profoundly hollow. She pressed a hand to her stomach right over the tight lacing of the corset and wondered how she was supposed to breathe in this house for the rest of her life. The eve of the wedding arrived with a violent thunderstorm. Rain lashed against the tall mullioned windows of the Ashbourne estate dining room, the wind howling down the massive stone chimneys. Genevieve sat at one end of a mahogany table that could comfortably seat 30 people. Arthur sat at the other end. Between them stretched a wasteland of silver candelabras, crystal goblets, and unappetizingly rich food. The silence was unbearable. It was a heavy textured thing broken only by the sharp clink of Arthur's silver knife cutting into a slice of roasted mutton and the rhythmic hollow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Genevieve stared at her plate. The peas looked gray in the candlelight. The meat tasted like ashes. She pushed a carrot around with her fork, listening to the scrape of metal on porcelain. Arthur was eating methodically. Cut, chew, swallow. He did not look at his food, nor did he look at her. He was staring at a leather-bound notebook placed precisely to the left of his wine glass. "The carriage will depart for the chapel at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." Arthur stated, his voice slicing through the silence without warning. He didn't look up from his book. "The ceremony will last precisely 45 minutes. Following that, there is a luncheon for 100 guests. You are expected to smile, nod, and feign a mild, polite exhaustion by 2 o'clock, so we may retire." Genevieve slowly put her fork down. The metal clattered against the plate. "Feign exhaustion?" she asked, her voice dry. Arthur flipped a page in his notebook. "It provides an acceptable excuse to end the reception early. I have a meeting with the harbor masters at 4 regarding the shipping manifests." Genevieve stared at him. He was marrying her tomorrow, and he had scheduled a business meeting for the afternoon of their wedding day. A sudden sharp bubble of hysterical laughter rose in her chest. She clamped her mouth shut to kill it, but a small, incredulous sound escaped her lips. Arthur's knife paused. He looked down the long expanse of the table, his eyebrows drawn together in a slight frown. "Do you find something amusing, Miss Croft?" "No, Your Grace," Genevieve said, leaning back in her heavy carved chair. "I find it remarkably efficient." He narrowed his eyes. He wasn't stupid. He caught the sarcasm dripping from her words. He set his knife down and picked up his wine glass, taking a slow sip. "Efficiency is the bedrock of a stable life," Arthur said, leaning forward slightly. "Chaos, emotion, unpredictable behavior. These are the things that ruin estates and destroy families. We have an arrangement. It is clean. It is predictable. You will lack for nothing physically. Your debts are paid. In return, I require order." Genevieve looked at the man she was to marry. He was handsome in a cold, statuesque way, but he felt entirely devoid of blood. He was governed by ink and wax, by rules and ledgers. Order! Genevieve repeated, her voice dropping. The cynicism that had protected her since the signing of the contract suddenly felt brittle. The reality of tomorrow was pressing down on her lungs. Do you ever laugh, Arthur? It was the first time she had used his Christian name. The word hung in the air, heavy and intimate. Arthur flinched. It was a micro-expression, a tightening of the jaw, a slight widening of the eyes, but Genevieve caught it. He looked at her as if she had just thrown a stone through the window. Laughter is a response to humor, Arthur replied stiffly, his voice dropping an octave. I have not found much humor in the management of this dukedom since my father's passing. And what of joy? She pushed, suddenly angry. She didn't know why she was angry. She had agreed to this. She had wanted cold, pragmatic safety. But sitting across from him, she felt the horrifying reality of 40 years of this silence stretching out before her. Will there be a line item in your ledger for joy, your grace? Perhaps scheduled for the third Tuesday of every month. Arthur stood up. The movement was sudden and violent, his chair scraping loudly against the oak floor. He planted his hands flat on the table, leaning toward her. The candlelight caught the sharp planes of his face, casting hollow shadows beneath his cheekbones. You were bought to be a wife, Miss Croft, not an inquisitor, he said. His voice was no longer a dull gravel. It was a low, dangerous hiss. Do not presume to dig into my character. You agreed to a contract. I suggest you remember your place within it. He didn't wait for her to answer. He grabbed his leather notebook turned on his heel and strode out of the dining room. Genevieve sat alone in the massive room, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. Her hands were shaking. She reached for her wine glass and took a long, unladylike gulp. The red wine burned her throat, but it was better than the cold knot of dread sitting in her stomach. She looked at his empty chair. He was terrified. That was the secret hiding beneath his ledgers and rules. Arthur Pendleton was a man so profoundly terrified of feeling anything that he had built a fortress of contracts to keep the world out. And tomorrow she was going to be locked inside that fortress with him. The rain continued to batter the glass, crying the tears that Genevieve refused to shed. She wiped a stray drop of wine from her lip, her jaw setting into a hard, stubborn line. He wanted a contract. He wanted a statue. She would give him exactly what he paid for. But as she looked at the silver knife he had left behind, reflecting the dancing flames of the candles, she knew one thing for certain: she was going to break him. The chapel smelled of damp stone burning beeswax and the cloying, decaying sweetness of hundreds of white lilies. It was an odor that made Genevieve think of funerals, not beginnings. She stood at the altar, her knees locked to keep from trembling. The oyster-white silk of her gown was a heavy, suffocating carapace. Beneath the stiff layers of tulle and the dense embroidery of seed pearls, her ribs throbbed. Mrs. Higgins had tightened the corset an extra inch that morning, muttering something about the Duke expecting perfection. Now every shallow breath Genevieve drew felt like drawing air through a crushed straw. Beside her, Arthur was a statue carved from obsidian and ice. He wore severe black-tailored coat and stark white linen. He didn't fidget. He didn't sway. He stared straight ahead at the Archbishop, his profile a harsh, unyielding line. He hadn't looked at her once since she had walked down the aisle. Do you, Arthur Pendleton, take this woman? The Archbishop droned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Genevieve let the words wash over her, a meaningless tide of ancient syllables. She focused on the cold weight of the ash-born sapphires resting against her collarbone. They were freezing against her skin, a heavy collar of blue ice, reminding her of the ledger, the bank draft, the 40,000 pounds that had bought her breathing rights in this damp, drafty sanctuary. He sounded exactly as he had when he confirmed the arrival of his shipping manifest. 2 syllables. And do you, Genevieve Croft? She closed her eyes. A sudden sharp memory pierced her, the smell of the rain on the moors back home, the mud on her boots, the absolute freedom of being a ruined man's forgotten daughter. She was trading the sky for a gilded cage. I do, she whispered. Her voice cracked, barely audible over the rustle of the congregation's silk and taffeta behind them. The ring, the Archbishop prompted. Arthur turned to her. His face was a mask of utter blankness. He took her left hand. His fingers were warm, dry, and terrifyingly strong. He slid a heavy, unadorned band of gold over her knuckle. It felt like a shackle snapping shut. I pronounce you husband and wife. There was a pregnant pause. The congregation waited. This was the moment of the seal, the public display of affection that validated the union. Arthur looked down at her. Genevieve tilted her chin up her neck, aching under the weight of the sapphires, and braced herself. He leaned in. He smelled of starch-shaving soap and that sharp, tense scent of cold rain. His lips brushed the very edge of her cheekbone. It was barely a kiss. It was the brushing of dry paper against her skin. He pulled back immediately, his jaw tight. "Come," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "We are 3 minutes behind schedule." The carriage ride back to the estate was an exercise in pure, unadulterated silence. They sat opposite each other in the swaying coach. The leather seats squeaked. The iron wheels ground over the cobblestones. Genevieve stared out the window at the passing gray streets of London, her vision blurring at the edges. The dress was torturing her. The heavily boned bodice was digging into her hip bones with every jolt of the carriage. The Brussels lace at her neckline, meant to hide her starved collarbones, scratched mercilessly at her sensitive skin. She shifted, trying to find a position that didn't drive the whalebone into her organs. The silk rustled loudly, a harsh, abrasive sound. Arthur looked up from the leather-bound portfolio he had opened the moment the carriage doors closed. He watched her for a long, silent moment. His eyes dropped to where her hands were clenched in her lap knuckles, white. "Are you unwell, madam?" he asked. Madam. Not Genevieve. Not even Miss Croft anymore. A title, a position. "The dress is heavy," Genevieve managed to say, forcing her jaw to unclench. Arthur looked at the dress, his expression unreadable. "It is the traditional gown. My mother wore it, and her mother before her. I am sure they found it just as agonizing." She snapped the pain fraying the edges of her enforced docility. A muscle feathered in Arthur's jaw. He closed the portfolio with a sharp snap. "Endurance is expected in your position. We have 100 guests awaiting us at the luncheon. You will smile. You will accept their congratulations. And at 2 o'clock, as agreed, you will feign a headache and retire." He looked away, staring at the velvet curtains of the carriage. "I do not ask for the impossible, Genevieve. I merely ask for competence." He had used her name. The shock of it, spoken in that low, gravelly voice, made her breath catch. But the words attached to it were so profoundly cold that they snuffed out any spark of humanity the name might have carried. She turned her face back to the window. "You shall have your competence, your grace, down to the very minute." The grand ballroom of the Ashbourne estate was a blinding sea of crystal gold leaf and predatory eyes. Genevieve stood beside Arthur in the receiving line for 2 hours. Her face ached from holding a serene, vacant smile. Her feet crammed into the narrow satin slippers felt bruised and bloody. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meats, heavy perfumes, and the sharp tang of champagne. "Ah, the new Duchess," purred Lord Harrington, an older man with a face like a squashed plum and eyes that lingered far too long on the slope of Genevieve's chest. "A beautiful acquisition, Ashbourne, though a bit pale, wouldn't you say?" Genevieve felt her stomach curdle. Acquisition. Arthur stood rigid beside her. "My wife's complexion is of no concern to anyone but her physician Harrington. If you would excuse us, there are other guests." He didn't defend her honor. He defended his property. There was a distinct difference, and Genevieve felt the hollow ring of it in her bones. She played her part flawlessly. She nodded at the dowagers who inspected her like a horse at auction. She offered polite, vapid responses to the young lords who snickered behind their gloved hands about her father's debts. She was a perfect porcelain doll operating on the mechanical turning of a key. but inside she was drowning. The physical pain was escalating. The seamstresses had reinforced the bodice so heavily to support the massive sapphire necklace that the silk felt like a wall of iron compressing her lungs. Her breaths were coming shorter, shallower. A cold sweat broke out across her nape, prickling beneath her heavy pinned hair. She glanced at Arthur. He was speaking to a grim-faced man about textile imports. He checked his pocket watch. The gold lid snapped open, then shut. He caught her looking. He gave a microscopic nod toward the grandfather clock standing against the far wall. It was 1:45. Genevieve closed her eyes for a brief second, summoning the last reserves of her energy. She swayed just slightly, allowing her hand to flutter up and press against her temple. She let out a soft, shuddering breath. Arthur was beside her in an instant. His hand wrapped around her elbow. His grip was tight, impersonal, supporting her weight without offering an ounce of comfort. "My wife is unwell," Arthur announced, his voice slicing through the chatter of the immediate crowd. It was a perfectly executed performance. He sounded properly grave, properly inconvenienced. The excitement of the day has overwhelmed her. She must retire. A chorus of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the guests. Lady Agatha, seated nearby, let out a loud theatrical sigh. "Frail," the old woman muttered loudly. "I told you she had no constitution." Arthur ignored his aunt. He steered Genevieve toward the grand staircase. "You performed adequately," he murmured under his breath as they ascended the marble steps away from the prying eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered bitterly. "I shall await my payment." He stopped on the landing, his grip on her elbow tightening painfully. He looked down at her, his flat eyes suddenly dark stormy. "Do not provoke me today, Genevieve." "I wouldn't dream of it," she said, pulling her arm from his grasp. "You have a meeting with the harbor masters at 4. I wouldn't want to disrupt your schedule with anything as messy as human emotion." She didn't wait for his reaction. She turned and began the long walk down the corridor to the east wing, her chambers, her prison. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind her with a sickening thud. The silence of the room was absolute. It was massive, decorated in oppressive shades of dark green and gold. The bed was a towering monstrosity of carved oak and heavy velvet drapes. "Mary," Genevieve called out, looking for the young maid who had been assigned to her. No answer. Genevieve walked into the adjoining dressing room. Empty. She walked to the bell pull and gave it a sharp yank. She waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. Nothing. The staff was likely entirely consumed by the massive luncheon downstairs. Arthur's schedule had accounted for her departure, but it hadn't accounted for a maid to be pulled away from serving 100 demanding aristocrats. She was alone. Genevieve walked to the towering pier glass in the corner of the room. She looked the heavy sapphire necklace. Her lips were bloodless. The clasp was a complicated sliding lock mechanism at the nape of her neck. Face. Her fingers numb and clumsy from the tight sleeves cutting off her circulation, fumbled with the cold metal. She couldn't grip it. Panic cold and sharp sparked in her chest. She dropped her hands and reached around to her back, trying to find the first hook of the corset laces. Her arms couldn't reach high enough. The stiff silk of the bodice pinned her shoulders, preventing her from bending her arms backward. She strained, a quiet whimper escaping her throat as the whalebone dug brutally into her bruised ribs. She was trapped. The panic didn't rise slowly. It exploded. Genevieve spun away from the mirror, her heavy skirts knocking a silver hairbrush off the vanity. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. Her breathing was frantic now, shallow gasps that provided no oxygen. The corset was a vice squeezing her lungs, her stomach, her heart. She clawed at the Brussels lace at her throat, tearing the delicate netting away from her skin. It tore with a soft, pathetic sound, but it didn't relieve the pressure of the bodice. The collar of sapphires felt like it was choking her. "Help!" She croaked the word, barely making it past her dry lips. But there was no one to hear. The walls of the east wing were thick, designed to keep the noise of the world out. She staggered backward, hitting the edge of the massive bed. She sank to the floor, the heavy silk pooling around her like a collapsing tent. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological terror was worse. This was her life now, trapped in a gilded cage bound by contracts, suffocating under the weight of expectations, and a man who viewed her as a line item. She was going to die in this dress, and Arthur would probably simply note the loss of his investment in his leather ledger. No. A primal, violent surge of adrenaline flooded her veins. It wasn't just panic anymore, it was fury. A deep, red-hot, blinding rage at her father, at the ton at Arthur, at the damn silk that was cutting into her flesh. She grabbed the thick, heavily beaded fabric at the center of her chest, right below the sapphires. Her knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door clicked open. Footsteps. Hard, measured mail. Arthur stepped into the doorway. He had removed his formal coat and was wearing only his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, his cravat slightly loosened. He held a silver tray with a single glass of water and a small powder packet. "I assumed your headache required—" He began, his gravelly voice echoing in the quiet room. He stopped dead. He saw her sitting on the floor, her hair half-pinned the lace at her throat, ripped, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She looked like a feral animal backed into a corner. "Genevieve!" His voice changed. The flat-board magistrate was gone. There was a sudden sharp crack of alarm in his tone. He took a step toward her, the silver tray rattling in his hands. She didn't look at him. She looked at the heavy silk gripped in her fists. She didn't want to be a duchess. She didn't want to be an acquisition. She wanted to breathe. Genevieve pulled her fists apart with every ounce of strength she possessed in her bruised, starving body. Her R.I.P. The sound was violently loud in the silent room. It was the sound of a scream rendered in thread and fabric. The thick oyster silk sheared down the middle. Hundreds of tiny seed pearls broke loose, hitting the hardwood floor like a downpour of hard hail. The heavy whalebone snapped with a sharp crack. The structural integrity of the dress gave way, and the tightly laced corset beneath it was suddenly exposed, the tension drastically reduced. Genevieve fell back against the bed frame, a massive, shuddering gasp of air filling her lungs. It burned. It was glorious. The silver tray hit the floor. The glass shattered water and powder splashing across the Persian rug. Arthur stood frozen. The mask, the rigid, perfectly constructed facade of the Duke of Ashbourne, simply dissolved. His eyes were wide, the flat, shilling gray suddenly filled with a chaotic, terrified darkness. His chest heaved. He looked at the torn silk, at the scattered pearls, and finally at her face. He didn't see a ruined dress. He saw a ruined woman, and he realized in a sudden, horrifying flash of clarity that he was the one who had built the cage. "Genevieve," he choked out. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides and dropped to his knees in the ruin of her skirts. He didn't care about the pearls biting into his knees. He didn't care about propriety. His hands, usually so controlled, were shaking violently. He reached for her, stopping an inch from her skin, terrified to touch her, terrified he might break her further. "You're bleeding," he whispered, his voice entirely raw, entirely human. Genevieve looked down. The snapping of the whalebone had sliced a shallow, angry line across her collarbone just below the heavy sapphires. A thin bead of red was welling up, staining the frayed edges of the white silk. She looked back up at him. She was crying now, silent tears tracking through the pale powder on her cheeks. She was broken, a mess of torn fabric and bruised skin, but as she looked at Arthur, at the man who was supposed to be made of ice, she saw the terror in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a contract. He was looking at his wife. "I couldn't breathe," she sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. Arthur swore. It was a vicious gutter-snipe curse that belonged on the docks, not in a ducal estate. He reached around to the back of her neck, his fingers fumbling with the complicated clasp of the sapphires. He didn't bother to slide the lock. He gripped the silver chain and gave it a brutal, sharp yank. The heavy necklace snapped, falling into her lap like a dead snake. Then his hands moved to her back. He gripped the heavy silk ribbons of the corset. He didn't try to untie the intricate knots the seamstress had made. He grasped the fabric of her underchemise and the ribbons, and with a low grunt of effort, he ripped those too. The pressure vanished entirely. Genevieve slumped forward entirely devoid of strength. Arthur caught her. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms tightly around her trembling frame. He buried his face in her half-ruined hair. She could feel the rapid, frantic pounding of his heart against her cheek. It was beating so fast it felt like a bird trapped in a snare. "Breathe," he murmured into her hair.
"Just breathe, Genevieve."
His voice thick,
"I've got
shaking.
you. I've got you.
Just breathe, Genevieve.
He was holding her tight.
"I've got you," rocking her
I've got
slightly
you.
back and forth.
He was holding
amidst
her
the wreckage
tight.
of her wedding dress. The Duke of Ashbourne. The man of ledgers and schedules sat on the floor, his hands tangled in torn silk, utterly shattered by the realization that he possessed a heart and that it was currently breaking for the woman in his arms. Genevieve closed her eyes, resting her head against the hard muscle of his shoulder. The room smelled of spilled water dust and the sharp male scent of Arthur's terrified sweat. It wasn't romantic. It was chaotic, messy, and painful. But as his hand stroked her hair with a desperate, clumsy gentleness, Genevieve realized one terrifying truth. The contract was void. The real marriage had just begun. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in Genevieve's bones. She sat on the edge of the massive oak bed. The ruined oyster silk hung around her waist in a jagged, heavy heap. Her shoulders were bare, the torn edges of her chemise slipping down her arms. She shivered. It was a violent, full-body tremor that rattled her teeth. Arthur stood across the room at the washstand. His back was to her. He had shed his waistcoat entirely, tossing it carelessly over a velvet chair. His white linen shirt clung to the sweat on his shoulders. He was moving erratically, opening drawers, rattling glass bottles, pouring water from a heavy porcelain pitcher into a basin. The sounds were loud and clumsy. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like a man who had narrowly survived a carriage wreck. He turned, holding a damp linen cloth and a small brown glass bottle. He walked toward her, his boots crunching loudly over the scattered seed pearls. He didn't seem to notice the destruction of the family heirlooms beneath his heels. He stopped in front of her. His chest was still heaving slightly. He looked down at the shallow, bloody scratch on her collarbone, and a muscle ticked violently in his jaw. "This will sting," he said. His voice was scraped raw. Genevieve didn't answer. She just stared at his hands. They were large, dusted with dark hair, the knuckles white from the tension gripping him. He uncorked the brown bottle with his teeth, spat the cork onto the floor, and tipped a few drops of iodine onto the linen. The smell hit her instantly. Sharp medicinal, entirely devoid of lavender or rosewater. It smelled like reality. He knelt. The movement forced him to push the heavy folds of her torn skirt out of the way. He didn't hesitate. He shoved the thousands of pounds of silk aside like dirty laundry. He pressed the linen to her skin. Genevieve hissed, her entire body jerking backward from the sharp, burning bite of the iodine. Arthur's free hand shot out, gripping her bare shoulder to steady her. His palm was hot. "I know," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the cut. "I know. Just a moment. Hold still." His touch was agonizingly careful. He dabbed the cut, wiping away the thin line of blood, cleaning the broken skin where the whalebone had sliced her. He didn't look at her face. He seemed terrified to meet her eyes. "You missed your meeting with the harbor masters," Genevieve said. Her voice sounded thin and raspy in the quiet room. Arthur paused. The damp linen hovered an inch from her chest. He slowly raised his head. His flat gray eyes were bloodshot. "Damn the harbor masters," he said softly. He pulled the cloth away and tossed it onto the silver tray lying sideways on the rug. He sat back on his heels, his hands resting on his thighs. He looked at the wreckage of the dress. "I did not know." He started, then stopped. He swallowed hard. "I did not comprehend the physical reality of the garments, the strictures. I merely paid the seamstress's bill." "You paid for a perfect silent statue," Genevieve replied, pulling the edges of her torn chemise up over her shoulders. The cynicism was back an automatic defense mechanism, sliding into place to cover her raw vulnerability. Statues do not need oxygen, Arthur. He flinched at the sound of his name. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking again. He clenched them into fists, forcing them still. I did not want a statue. He said, the words dragged out of him like rusted nails from dry wood. I wanted... He closed his eyes. I wanted safety. Safety from what? From the noise. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The absolute bleakness in his expression made her breath catch. From the utter destructive chaos that consumed my father, this house, and everything it touched. He felt everything Genevieve, every passion, every rage, every sorrow. And he bled this estate dry, chasing those feelings. He died screaming at phantoms in the West Wing, leaving behind a mountain of debts and a family name dragged through the mud. Arthur stood up, running a hand through his dark hair, ruining its precise styling. I swore I would never allow that disease into my life. No unpredictable variables, no passions, just order, just contracts. He looked at the torn dress again. And in doing so, I nearly choked you to death on your wedding day. A sharp knock sounded at the heavy mahogany door. Your Grace, a muffled voice called out. It was Thomas the butler. The guests are departing. Shall I send up the maid for her Grace? Arthur's gaze snapped to the door. The mask of the Duke tried to slide back into place, but it didn't fit anymore. It was cracked. No. Arthur barked his voice, carrying the harsh authority of his title. Dismiss the staff from this wing. No one is to disturb us until tomorrow morning. Am I understood? A beat of silence. Yes, Your Grace. Footsteps retreated rapidly down the hall. Arthur turned back to the washstand. He grabbed his own discarded white linen shirt, the one he had worn beneath his coat that morning. He walked back to Genevieve and held it out. Take this off, he ordered, nodding toward the heavy, ruined silk pooling at her waist. It is cutting into your hips. Put my shirt on. Genevieve looked at him, then at the shirt. She didn't argue. Her fingers, still numb and clumsy, fumbled with the remaining laces at her lower back. Arthur didn't help her this time. He turned his back, staring resolutely at the burning embers in the fireplace, giving her the dignity of privacy. She pushed the dress down. It hit the floor with a heavy final thud, like a fallen suit of armor. She stepped out of it wearing only her thin cotton drawers and pulled Arthur's shirt over her head. It was massive. The hem hit her knees. The linen was soft, worn in a way her stiff new clothes were not. Her hair, a wild half, smelled a mess. Her skin sandalwood starch and marked with that sharp scent of cold rain. He didn't look repulsed. He didn't look disappointed. He walked over to the bed and pulled back the heavy velvet quilt. Lie down, he said quietly. Genevieve crawled into the massive bed. The sheets were cold. Arthur walked to the fireplace, picked up the iron poker, and viciously stabbed at the dying logs until a spark caught and flames roared back to life. He didn't leave. He dragged the heavy velvet armchair to the side of the bed, sat down, and rested his elbows on his knees. Sleep, Genevieve, he commanded softly, staring at the fire. I will keep the noise out. She lay in the massive bed, the smell of his shirt surrounding her, the sharp scent of iodine on her skin. She looked at the Duke of Ashbourne guarding her sleep like a broken, exhausted sentinel. For the first time since her father signed the papers, Genevieve closed her eyes and actually breathed. 3 days passed. The rain did not stop. It was a relentless drumming assault against the thick glass windows of the estate, turning the sprawling grounds into a sea of gray mud. The house was suspended in a strange, suffocating silence. The staff moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their eyes averted. The scandalous early departure from the wedding reception, followed by the complete isolation of the East Wing, had fueled a firestorm of whispered gossip in the servants' quarters. Genevieve remained in her chambers. The deep purple bruises around her ribs, the brutal legacy of the corset, made drawing a deep breath painful. But the physical ache was nothing compared to the disorienting reality of her new existence. Arthur had not returned to his ledgers. It was an omission so glaring it felt like a physical absence in the house. The morning after the wedding, his secretary had arrived with a stack of urgent shipping manifests. Arthur had met the man in the hallway, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, and sent him away. Now he was simply present. He didn't crowd her. He didn't attempt false intimacies. He occupied the space in her periphery with the awkward, tense energy of a wild animal confined to a parlor. It was late afternoon on the third day. Genevieve sat in a wingback chair by the window, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, reading a volume of poetry she had found in the library. She wasn't actually reading. She was staring at the same stanza for 20 minutes listening. The door handle clicked. Arthur entered carrying a silver tray. He looked exhausted. The dark smudges beneath his eyes had deepened into bruised hollows. He wore a simple dark coat entirely devoid of the stiff formality he usually favored. He set the tray on the small table beside her. It held a pot of black tea, 2 porcelain cups, and a plate of thinly sliced cold beef and sharp cheddar. Real food, not the gray, complicated French cuisine they had eaten on the eve of their wedding. Cook attempted to send up a squab glazed in some sort of cherry reduction. Arthur set his voice flat. He poured the tea. I told her to feed it to the hounds. You require iron and protein, not fruit-soaked poultry. He handed her a teacup. His fingers brushed hers. He didn't flinch away this time, though his jaw tightened. Thank you, Genevieve said. She took a sip. It was brutally strong, bitter, and hot enough to scald her tongue. It was perfect. Arthur did not sit. He paced to the fireplace, prodded a perfectly burning log with his boot, and turned back to her. He looked like a man standing on a gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. My Aunt Lady Agatha is waiting in the drawing room, he stated abruptly. Genevieve lowered her teacup. The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer. The very mention of the woman made the bruises on her ribs throb. She has come to inquire about your constitution, and to demand an explanation for our absence from Lord Danbury's ball last evening, an engagement that was contracted in our social calendar 3 months ago. Arthur was staring at her intently. He was waiting for her reaction. He was waiting for her to panic or to apologize, or to agree to strap herself back into a whalebone cage to appease the old woman. Genevieve set her tea down. She looked at the plate of cold beef, then up at her husband. She felt a sudden profound exhaustion with the games of the aristocracy. If you wish for me to dress Arthur, you will need to summon Mrs. Higgins, though I fear she will need to bring a new corset. The last one seems to have met a violent end. She kept her voice entirely neutral, devoid of sarcasm, just stating facts. Arthur's eyes flared. It was a sudden burst of heat in the gray. You will not wear a corset in this house again unless it is of your own volition, he snapped. The words were bitten off harsh and final. Genevieve blinked, startled by the ferocity of his tone. Arthur ran a hand heavily over his face. I am not asking you to dress. I am informing you of the situation because I made a vow to myself 3 days ago that I would no longer keep you in the dark regarding the machinery of this estate. He walked back to the table, leaning his hands flat against the mahogany surface, bringing his face closer to hers. He smelled of strong tea and damp wool. I'm going downstairs, Genevieve. I'm going to inform my aunt that my wife's health and comfort supersede any social contract, ball, or luncheon. I'm going to tell her that if she ever again comments on the prominence of your bones or the adequacy of your constitution, she will find her allowance severed and her access to this estate permanently revoked. Genevieve stared at him. Her heart gave a sudden hard thump against her bruised ribs. You would do that? She is your family. She is a parasite, Arthur corrected coldly. She thrives on the rules that keep people small and quiet. I have spent my entire life feeding that machine. I will not feed you to it. He pushed off the table. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the brass knob. He looked back at her over his shoulder. Eat the beef, Genevieve. I will return shortly. He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Genevieve sat alone in the quiet room. The relentless drumming of the rain against the glass suddenly felt less oppressive. She looked at the plate of food he had brought her. He hadn't sent a servant. He had gone to the kitchens, terrorized the cook into abandoning her fancy menu, and carried the tray up 3 flights of stairs himself. He was a man terrified of emotion, yet he was systematically dismantling his entire world to protect her from it. She picked up a slice of sharp cheddar and took a bite. The tang of the cheese exploded on her tongue. She closed her eyes. The cynical shell she had built around her heart, the day her father sold her, was cracking. Arthur wasn't breaking her. She was breaking him, and in the process he was slowly, clumsily learning how to put them both back together. Downstairs, the faint, sharp sound of a woman's outraged shriek echoed up through the floorboards, followed by the heavy final slam of the front door. Genevieve smiled. It was a small, raw thing, but it was real. It was midnight. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, dripping silence. The moonlight cut through the tall windows of the East Wing bedroom, casting long, pale rectangles across the Persian rug. Genevieve was awake. She lay in the massive bed, watching the embers in the fireplace pulse with a dull, dying orange light. The bruises on her ribs were fading to a sickly yellow, the physical pain receding into memory. But the emotional tension in the room was a thick, heavy wire drawn tight. Arthur was sitting in the velvet armchair by the hearth. He had been there for an hour. Neither of them had spoken. He was staring into the fire, a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid resting on his knee. He hadn't taken a sip. In his other hand, resting on the arm of the chair, was a thick roll of parchment tied with a black silk ribbon. Genevieve knew what it was. She recognized the heavy vellum, the rigid curl of the paper. It was their marriage contract, the ledger of her purchase. Arthur finally moved. He set the crystal glass on the floor. The heavy base thumped against the wood. He stood unspooling the black ribbon with a quick, decisive pull. It drifted to the floor like a dead snake. He unrolled the parchment in the magistrate's office. The heavy wax seal at the bottom, the deep red imprint rolled up, exposing the dark hair on his forearms. Caught the dim light of the cravat was gone. He walked to the edge of the bed. His collar was unbuttoned, revealing the strong, tense cords of his neck. He held the contract out, offering it to her. "Read it," he commanded softly. Genevieve sat up slowly, pulling the quilt up to her chest. She took the heavy parchment. The paper was dry, smelling of old dust and cold ink. She didn't need to read it. She had memorized the damn thing. Item 4. The Duchess shall maintain separate quarters in the East Wing. Item 7. The Duchess shall not inquire into the Duke's financial or personal affairs. Item 9. The Duchess shall ensure a quiet, scandal-free existence. I know what it says, Arthur. She said, her voice a quiet rasp in the dark room. It says you are an acquisition. He replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was a terrifyingly calm tone. It says your primary function is to exist without causing a ripple. It says I bought your silence to cover my terror of the noise. He stepped closer. His knees hit the edge of the mattress. 3 days ago, I watched you rip a 1,000-pound gown to shreds because my rules were suffocating you. I watched you bleed on the floor of my house. Arthur's voice finally cracked. The calm shattered. I built this fortress, Genevieve. I built it with ledgers and contracts and distance. I thought if I controlled every variable, I could survive. He reached out and closed his hands over hers, gripping the edges of the parchment. His skin was burning hot against her cold fingers. But I am not surviving. He whispered, his gray eyes locking onto hers, fierce and completely unguarded. I am suffocating too. I sit in my study and I stare at numbers, and all I can hear is the sound of that silk tearing. All I can see is the terror in your eyes. And I realize... He swallowed a painful, visible working of his throat. I realize I would rather burn my entire estate to the ground than ever see you look at me like that again. Genevieve stared at him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She looked down at the contract in her hands. The ink looked ridiculous now, black scratches on dead skin. "What are you saying, Arthur?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am saying the contract is void." He didn't wait for her to let go. He pulled the parchment from her hands. He turned to walk the 3 steps to the hearth and tossed the heavy vellum directly onto the glowing embers. For a second, nothing happened. Then a corner caught. A bright sudden flame licked up the side of the paper. The wax seal began to melt, the deep red ashbourne crest warping, liquefying, and dripping into the ashes. The parchment curled violently, blackening as the fire consumed the ink, the rules, the 40,000 pounds. The smell of burning wax and scorched paper filled the room. It was harsh, acrid, and completely liberating. Arthur watched it burn until there was nothing left but a fragile black husk. He turned his back on the fire and walked back to the bed. He didn't stop at the edge this time. He climbed onto the mattress. His weight dragged the blankets down, pulling Genevieve toward him. He knelt in front of her, his large frame blocking out the moonlight. "I don't know how to do this." Arthur confessed, his voice a raw, desperate whisper. He raised his hands, hesitating before resting his palms flat against her cheeks. His thumbs brushed the fine hair at her temples. "I don't know how to be the man who doesn't use a ledger. I am deeply inherently flawed, Genevieve. I am cynical, I am rigid, and I am terrified." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. He smelled of smoke whiskey and the heavy, intoxicating scent of a man completely stripped bare. "But I want the noise." He breathed the words, brushing against her lips. "I want the chaos. I want you to ruin my schedules, Genevieve. I want you to tear down the walls. Be angry, be loud, be entirely imperfectly real. Just do not be quiet." Genevieve closed her eyes. The cynical armor she had worn since the day in the magistrate's office finally definitively cracked open and fell away. She lifted her hands, pulling her arms out from beneath the heavy quilt. She reached up and tangled her fingers in the dark, messy hair at the nape of his neck. She felt him shudder at the contact. "You will hate it, Arthur," she whispered against his mouth, a watery, broken laugh escaping her throat. "I am terribly messy. I leave books everywhere. I despise early mornings, and I will inevitably argue with you about the shipping manifests." "Argue with me," he pleaded, his hand slipping down her neck to grip her shoulders, pulling her flush against his chest. "Destroy my ledgers. Ruin me, Genevieve." He kissed her. It wasn't a practiced, polite brushing of lips. It was a collision. It was clumsy, desperate, and hungry. Teeth clashing, breath mingling. It tasted of salt and smoke and years of suppressed humanity finally breaking free. Arthur's arms wrapped entirely around her, lifting her slightly off the mattress, crushing her against him. He wasn't holding a statue. He was holding a woman warm, soft, and alive. Genevieve kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands gripping the strong line of his shoulders, anchoring herself to the storm she had finally unleashed. The kiss deepened, a frantic exploration of a territory neither of them had ever dared to chart. The physical ache in her ribs was forgotten, replaced by a deep burning ache in her stomach, a raw physical desire that matched the emotional earthquake tearing through the room. He pulled back just a fraction of an inch, both of them breathing hard, harsh pants in the quiet night. He looked down at her, his eyes dark, heavy, and completely present. He traced the line of her jaw with a shaking thumb, his gaze dropping to the fading scratch on her collarbone, the scar of her rebellion. "No more cages." Arthur promised, his voice a low, gravelly vow that carried more weight than 100 signed contracts. Genevieve smiled up at him. It was a real smile, a messy, imperfect, triumphant smile. "No more cages," she agreed. She pulled him back down. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed as the last remnants of the contract turned to gray dust, completely forgotten, as the Duke of Ashbourne finally surrendered his fortress to the woman who had broken it apart. The ink is ash, the silk is shredded, and the Duke of Ashbourne finally learned that you cannot bind a human heart with a legal ledger. Sometimes the only way to build a real marriage is to burn the contract to the ground and brave the messy, unpredictable chaos underneath. If you loved watching Genevieve tear down Arthur's walls and his rigid rules, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more raw, unapologetic romances, and share this story with someone who knows that the best love stories are the ones that shatter expectations. See you in the next chapter.